This lecture is going to cover the art of Greece, Rome, and the early Judeo Christian world, and ancient art from some other places around the world that are happening at this time period. It corresponds with Chapter 15 of Understanding Art, 11th edition. The learning objectives for this lecture include to be able to summarize the major reoccurring ideas in ancient Greek art, trace the development of vase painting, sculpture, and architectural styles through the Greek geometric, archaic, classical, and Hellenistic periods, summarize influences on the Romans, including Etruscan art and architecture, describe the political systems of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, discuss how the Romans integrated influences from other cultures with Roman innovations to create a distinctive artistic style, and describe important qualities of the art of early Buddhism, the Qin and Han dynasties in China, and the Olmec culture in Mesopotamia. I think it's safe to say that the ancient Greek culture has had a really long-lasting and far-reaching influence on not only Western art, but civilization in general. And we can trace science, mathematics, law, politics, art back to some ancient Greek influences. And we are going to look at eventually the Greeks getting absorbed by Rome, but the Romans really assimilated the Greek culture into theirs, and so kind of lived on through the ancient Romans. Where the Greeks are really kind of known for the intellectual and creative achievements, Rome is more known for cultural contributions in the area of building and city planning, government, and law. So we're going to call the artistic legacy of Greece and Rome classical art that is still influencing a lot of Western art today. So when we look at the art of ancient Greece, we're going to characterize it by these words in bold. Humanism, which is the view that humans are the center of the universe. Rationalism, a philosophy in which knowledge comes from reason rather than from the other senses. Naturalism, or truth to reality based on a keen observation of nature. And idealism, the representation of forms according to an accepted standard of beauty. And here's our timeline that we're going to go through in terms of talking about the artwork. Just so you're aware, this is a good slide that you could come back to just to kind of remind yourself which period we're talking about with some of the particular artwork that we're looking at and the progression through time. Okay, so here's a little map of the area of the world that we're starting with, ancient Greece. And the textbook says, from ancient Greece come the name of the dramatists, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and Sophocles, the poets Homer and Hesiod, the philosophers Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, scientists like Archimedes, and mathematicians like Euclid, and the historian Herodotus. It has given us gods like Zeus, Apollo, Athena, Aphrodite, and heroic figures named Achilles and Odysseus and Penelope. Even more astonishing, although Greek culture spans almost 1,000 years, its golden age or period of greatest achievement lasted no more than 80 years. As with many civilizations, the development of Greece occurred over a cycle of birth, maturation, perfection, and decline. Okay, so we're going to start with the geometric period, and we're going to look at that for a few centuries. And the geometric period is called this because of its predominance of geometric shapes and patterns in the work of art. Here is a good example. This is a vase that would have been placed as a funeral marker. And this is a good example of the geometric style. If you look at the registers, you can see some human forms depicted, and their upper bodies are essentially triangle shapes. And that is a really good way just to know when you're looking at the geometric period. Remember that word, geometric shapes, things like triangles, squares, circles. A lot of the shapes are geometric, hence why we call it this. We also see some just patterns of just repeated shapes, a lot of zigzag lines, kind of the meandering line, which is the one that kind of goes around the top register on the rim of the vase, and just some other square patterns and things like that. So as I mentioned, this would have been used as a grave marker, and you can see that the deceased person is actually featured there in that center. The register that is the widest, the deceased person is laying horizontally, and there's some figures on either side of him. It was most likely a Greek soldier, and there's people around him. There's some chariots below, and some other like the animals like guiding the chariots depicted there as well. Okay, then we move into the Archaic period from about 660 to 480 BCE. And during this time, there's a growing emphasis on the human figure, which replaced the geometric motifs. So we're going to get more into the style of naturalism. Important artistic developments during the Archaic period included an emphasis on sculptures of the human form, which gradually shifted towards naturalism, the birth of the major forms of Greek architecture, and the black figure and red figure styles of vase painting. So where we see our move towards naturalism. So this sculpture is called a kouros sculpture, and it would have been once again used as a marker for someone's burial. It's a usually funerary statues. Sometimes they were used for devotional statues, like at a temple or something like that. But for the most part, funerary statues. And you can see some similarities with ancient Egyptian sculpture. Remember the sculpture of Khafra, very kind of rigid, depicted pretty idealized in terms of kind of strong, most idealized body form, muscular, things like that. But we also see some pretty stylized ways of depicting the hair and the eyes, right? The eyes are just kind of these little almond shapes. The hair is just, the texture of it is just kind of these repeated lines. So it is somewhat an abstracted figure, but we see a little bit of a move towards naturalism. The body itself looks pretty rigid and kind of almost kind of frozen in time, like it was, just kind of cut from a block of stone. It doesn't feel very relaxed. And okay, and the one other thing I want to mention is the facial expression. It's not totally blank. It's like this ever so slightly pleasant look on their face, and this is actually called an archaic smiles because it's from the Archaic period. It's not a bright, shiny, cheesy smile, but it's ever so slightly turned up, just kind of like pleasantly smiling. So that is the archaic smile that you see in there. Okay, so later on, we'll move a little bit more towards naturalism, and you can see in this sculpture just how much more emphasis there is on kind of the form of the human body in terms of noticing like the roundness, right, from the muscles and things like that. You can see a little bit more realistic proportions. The flesh looks a little bit more fleshy. The hair is still kind of stylized with its patterns, but even the face, the eye shape is look a little bit more naturalistic. Everything is moving a little bit more towards a more realistic depiction. This is also the chrysos is another grave marker that would have been for a fallen soldier as well. Okay, so let's look at some architecture, and these are kind of the foundation of ancient Greek architecture. And I am sure that as you go about in your daily life, you will see buildings that still show some of this influence. So we have mostly the temples for their gods the gods are what these architecture styles reflect. So ancient Greece, much like the ancient Egyptians, polytheistic society, they believed in more than one god. And these styles were used for temples. So there are three styles, or in Greek architecture, we call them orders. And we have the Doric and the Ionic depicted here. And eventually there's a Corinthian order which is not depicted here. But I'm mostly interested in you recognizing the Doric and the Ionic. So I'm going to go to the next slide and show you the main things that I want you to be able to identify. So if I were to show you a little, temple graphic like this with nothing labeled, these are the things that I would want you to be able to identify. So the base of the temple, essentially the floor, we have the stereobate and the stylobate, and that's just kind of like the floor level, which I won't ask you to be able to tell the difference between. But really the main thing about how to identify the Doric order and the Ionic order has to do with the columns. So the Doric order over on the left, the column has no fancy base on the bottom. The column just starts, and then we have a fluted shaft, which means that if you were to touch that, it's rigid, like it goes up and down around. So the lines that are drawn on there are to show the ridges of the column. And then when we get to the top of the column, the top piece is called the capital, and that's how you know if it's Doric or Ionic. If you can look at the difference, Doric is really plain, and it just kind of gets to the top. And then above that, in a temple, we have some other parts, and every single thing has a name. The entablature is the part before the roof. And I'm mostly interested in you being able to identify the area that is the frieze, because the frieze often had sculptural elements in it. So I want you to be able to know where a frieze is on a temple. If I, asked you where it was, it's the part right below the pediment. So the pediment is that triangular piece, which is the roof of the building. Often the pediment, that triangular piece, would have had sculptures placed in it as well. There were sculptures all over, but you'll see some examples throughout the lecture today of pieces that were once placed in these temples. And I want you to know where the pediment is. I want you to know where the frieze is. And then I want you to be able to tell the difference between the Doric order and the Ionic order. If you look over on the Ionic order, the column has a base to it, and then it also has just the fluted shaft once again. And then at the top, the capital of an Ionic is these kind of scroll looking shapes that look like they're kind of rolled up on them. So those are the parts that I'm going to ask you to be aware of, and make sure that you could identify them. So I won't make you do every single word, but make sure those ones that are circled are that you're aware of. Okay, so we mentioned some figure painting. So in the archaic period, we have what's called black figure painting, and this has to do with what colors are used and how the firing of the clay is done in order to get black figures versus kind of a reddish background. And there is a lot of process that goes involved with painting slip, which is watered down clay, and when things are fired, introducing oxygen into the kiln and cutting off the oxygen. So it's not super important that you understand that whole process, but the most important thing is if you look at this vase, you can identify it as black figure painting because all of the figures are painted black. Hopefully that makes sense. Here is another example of black figure painting. So this one is depicting a pretty famous scene from the Iliad. And we have Ajax, who's playing a game of dice with his cousin Achilles. And this one, you can see that in this depiction, the figures are almost completely in profile. So keep in mind like the geometric period and even into some of the artwork we looked at from ancient Egypt Egypt and Mesopotamia, a lot of times we have that composite pose of we see the front of the chest, but then the legs or the face are in profile. In this example, we're moving more towards naturalism, where if someone's turned sideways, their whole body would have been turned sideways. So they're almost completely in profile. And you see the men hunched over the table. Achilles is on the left with his helmet on, and their shields are kind of propped up as if it's resting up against the wall. And this is kind of them just kind of relaxing for a little bit before they go into battle. We do actually know the creator of this work, Exachius, who was both the potter and the painter, and so this is one of the earliest examples of we know who the artist is of this one. So then we're going to move into red figure painting. So this is where all of the figures appear reddish. So hopefully you can see the difference there. And we have the background or the negative space in black. And this just has to do with being able to create more details. And remember, it has a certain firing process. So in this case, everything that is black is the slip part. And so they essentially, the artist had to go through and paint the negative space, like all around where they wanted the figures to be, but then they could go back on top, right, of the figures and paint those details in, which is kind of the opposite of what they did for the black figure painting. So the red figure painting allows for a lot more detail than what they could do with the red figure one. And in this case, this is another scene from this is a Trojan War scene, and this is the death of Sarpedon. So we see kind of this graphic violence happening on this vase. But the most important thing that I want you to see, not only just the move towards naturalism with just the body positions and how realistic looking some of the figures are, but also just be aware that it is red figure painting. Okay, now we're moving into the early classical period. So the change from the archaic to the classical period coincided with the Greek victory over the Persians in 480 BCE. And the early classical sculpture developed beyond archaic stylizations, although we'll maybe see some of the rigidity of the earlier period remaining. Here is a sculpture that is not the original Greek sculpture. This is actually a Roman marble copy after the original bronze, which no longer exists, but we know that this one was a copy. And this is called the discus thrower. And once again, we are starting to move even more towards realistic depictions. The sculptor of this one was Myron, and this is a sculpture that depicts an event from the Olympic Games. So this is the discus throw, and this is an athlete. And what I think is important that we mention about this one is just the twisting in space, right? Think of the Kouros sculptures that we looked at before, all facing front, very rigid. This one is, one arm's raised, one arm is down, the body itself is twisted, the legs are in different positions. It is very much, capturing this moment in time. We have a sense of movement with the way that the body is depicted. We see the rib cage through the skin. So this is, there's kind of this balance between motion and stability, and we have a lot more realistic depiction of the human form. Greek sculpture and architecture reached their height of perfection during what we call the classical period from 480 to 404 BCE. Greece turned its attention to rebuilding monuments that were destroyed during the Persian Wars and advancing art, drama, and music. In Athens, a lot of these accomplishments occurred under the leadership of this dynamic statesman, Pericles. One of the most famous buildings that was built during this time was the Parthenon, probably one of the most famous buildings in Western culture at all. When the Persians destroyed a lot of the original buildings on the Acropolis, the Athenians refused to rebuild all the temples and their shrines with the stones that had been desecrated. So they cleared it out. The Acropolis is just a large area in Athens. It's kind of raised up, kind of on a plateau, and it's essentially like a temple complex. It had a whole bunch of different temples to different gods. It would be where you would come if you were coming to worship. And the Parthenon was the one of the largest temples, and it was sacred to the goddess Athena, who is the protector of Athens, and that's where the name comes from. So in this temple, there would have been a large sculpture of Athena that no longer exists. Excuse me, but we do know that there was a 40-foot high statue of Athena inside. And let's look at this temple for a moment and see if you can identify the order. Is it Doric or is it Ionic? It is Doric. So take a moment and just notice the columns and their Doric order, and then above them you have the frieze, and then the pediment, which you can see there's a little bit of sculpture still left up there, but most of the sculptures are missing from that, and that is actually going to be the topic of your discussion post here this week. And we'll come back to that here in just a moment. I think I'm going to jump ahead to the sculptures from there. So these three goddesses are sculptures that would have been in the east pediment of the Parthenon. They have a lot of parts broken off. So just keep in mind that they are missing a lot of their pieces. Originally, they would have, they are these sculptures are depicted more naturalistically. They have the fabric on them. They actually describe it as kind of wet drapery because it almost looks like the cloth is kind of wet the way that it clings to the bodies of the figures depicted. And you'll be learning a little bit more about these sculptures from your discussion posts, but it's a controversial removal of them from Greece to the British Museum in London. One other thing I wanted to mention about the Parthenon is that while it looks very, excuse me, straight and perpendicular in terms of its architectural features, it is important to know that there are some little variations in how it was built. For example, the floor actually kind of rises up just a little bit as it gets to the center and then goes down. The columns that are on the corners are a little bit wider in diameter than the rest of the columns. And actually, the columns, as they go from the ground up towards their capital, they actually swell a little bit in the center, meaning they get a little bit wider as they go up. And they are not all perfectly straight up and down. So, of course, scholars have tried to figure out why this was true. And a lot of people say, there's this balance between making it follow their system of architectural proportions, but also have a little bit of organic appearance. So it's kind of one of those things that they wanted it to have its greatest aesthetic quality. So I think part of those little variations help it have a little bit more plasticity, a little bit more life to it. So the history of the Parthenon is really interesting. Eventually, it has served a lot of different functions. It was a Byzantine church, a Roman Catholic church. It has been a mosque. It had ammunition stored in it at one point, and then also part of it blew up during an explosion. So it is now, of course, a protected site that is visited by tourists often. But all of that history plays into what you'll learn about this week with the pieces that have been removed from it. So we mentioned the system of proportions, and we talked about this a little bit when we first talked about proportion. And the classical period is one that we see these systems of proportions really applying to the sculptures. So this is Polyclitus's spear bearer sculpture, or Doryphorus. And remember, we've talked about how there were systems of proportions developed during this time period. Philosophers such as Pythagoras, who you may have heard of before with his mathematical formulas, he tried to explain beauty in terms of harmonic proportions that are observable in nature. And he believed that you could express them mathematically. And Polyclitus built on Pythagoras's notions of these proportions, and used them to develop this set of rules, or his canon, that was ideal beauty in the human form. And so there's a ratio that is used to measure all things on the human body, from like the length of the finger to the length of the leg to how wide the head is. And while we don't have Polyclitus's theory written down exactly, we do have some other writers like Pliny the Elder who wrote some things down that kind of give us clues about what Polyclitus believed in. And so I'm going to go to the next slide and show you this. Remember, we talked about a little bit of, Greek art having this balance between motion and stability, and tension and relaxation. And this is a great example in the way that the artist depicted the spear bearer using contrapposto. So contrapposto is this slight shift in the alignment of the hips. Essentially, if you're standing on the ground and your weight is being equally distributed between both feet, your hip bones are going to be in the same plane, right? They're going to be equal. But if you shift all of your weight onto one leg, your hips are going to shift. And that's what's depicted in this spear bearer. His weight is all on his right leg, and the tension is also balanced in his left arm, where there would have been a spear at one time. And then the left leg is the one that's relaxed, and his right arm is relaxed. So you can see the little graphic kind of showing that balance. And once again, this is not the original sculpture, but this is a Roman copy of the original one that we know existed, but no longer exists now. Okay, we're going to move into the late classical period. It lasted from 404 to 323 BCE, and that was the year of the death of Alexander the Great. So the late classical period brought a more humanistic and naturalistic style with emphasis on the expression of emotion. The stocky muscularity of the Polyclitan ideal was replaced by a more languid sensuality and graceful proportions. This sculpture by Praxiteles is one of the few actual ones from the late classical period that we still have. So this is not a Roman copy. This is the original. And we can see the strong emphasis on naturalism in this sculpture. Here we have Dionysus, who is the god of wine, holding Hermes, who is the messenger god, but here depicted as a baby. And we see some of that same contrapposto that we just saw in the previous sculpture, but in this case, it's exaggerated to the point where we call it an S curve. So you can look, if you started a line down from Dionysus' right leg and drew it up through his hip and kind of curves over to his the top of his body, almost forms like the letter S. His right arm is broken. Scholars believe that at one time he was holding a little bunch of grapes that the baby Hermes was reaching for. But I want you to just think about how far have we come in sculpture since those Kouros sculptures, where these figures, it almost looks like real flesh, real fabric. Look at how the drapery kind of folds down on the supporting base that's helping to support the sculpture. The hair depiction looks way more realistic. The body, even, just the skin looks more realistic, like actual flesh. And then even look at the interaction of the figures. We have Dionysus looking at Hermes. There's, almost like an awareness of like of a humanity there. So that is a really good example of this late classical focus on realistic depictions. So a follower of Praxiteles was a Lysipos. And you can see that in this sculpture, we're now moving into another plane. So in this case, the Apoxymenos is a figure whose arm was coming forward, and this is a depiction of an athlete, and what he's doing is he would have been holding a scraper, and he's actually kind of like running it down his skin to kind of scrape off the oil and grime that would have been formed on his body. But the important thing that we're looking at here is the fact that the body still has that contrapposto pose. It looks even kind of more casual and relaxed. And it's now moving into the part where a lot of these sculptures have been kind of frontally focused, where the idea is stand in front of it and look at it. But in this sculpture, it's almost like you're being kind of invited to walk all the way around it and look at it from 360 degrees, where it's not necessarily just frontal view, by incorporating that arm kind of moving into the forward space. And it's said that Lysipos was very respected as a sculptor. He was actually the court sculptor for Alexander the Great, and it is said that he was the only sculptor permitted to execute portraits of Alexander the Great. And we're moving into the Hellenistic period. So the Hellenistic art developed in the vast region conquered by Alexander the Great, Persia, Egypt, and the Near East. The Hellenistic period lasted from 323 to 140 BCE, when Greece became part of the province of Rome. Hellenistic art is characterized by excessive, almost theatrical emotion and the use of illusionistic effects to heighten realism. This is a great example of Hellenistic art. This is Laocoon and his sons, and it is from a part. It tells the story of the Trojan War. So, just a little background: if you are familiar with the Trojan War, it all starts with Helen of Troy. But this particular scene, Laocoon was a Trojan priest, and he warned the Trojans against bringing into their city the wooden horse that was left by the Greeks. Perhaps you remember the story of the Trojan horse. The Greeks built this giant horse and left it as a gift for the Trojans, and the Trojans were tricked and brought it into the city, and at night all the Greeks jumped out and attacked. So Laocoon was a priest who was warning the Trojans, don't bring that in. And Poseidon, the god of the ocean, was on the side of the Greeks, and he was trying to get Laocoon to shut up and stop warning the Trojans. So he sent these giant serpents to attack Laocoon and his sons. And this is what we are seeing in the moment. It is the kind of the height of the drama. So some pieces have been damaged, but you can see these serpents entangling Laocoon and his two sons. I mean, they are twisting and turning all over. You can see the figure on the right side, reaching down, trying to get the snake off of his leg. You see the folding of the drapery. Laocoon's body is twisting. You can see the emotion on his face. I love the one serpent that's like biting his hip over there. I mean, this is kind of the ancient Greek version of Snakes on a Plane. It is the height of action, being attacked by these big sea serpents, and we kind of have this almost theatrical drama like the previous slide talked about. So while we mentioned that ancient Greek art has this balance of, tension and relaxation, emotionality, emotions versus calmness, Hellenistic art tends to be more on the emotional side. But this sculpture is a good example of the kind of more serene and idealized form, not quite so emotional. This is used to be kind of referred to as the Venus de Milo. However, since it's ancient Greek art and we still use the Greek terms for the gods, the more appropriate one is to call this an Aphrodite sculpture, so goddess of love. It has been damaged, but this one is a very idealized human form. You can see that now the depiction of the hair and the facial features very realistic compared to where we've come from with the archaic sculpture of ancient Greece. Eventually, Greece becomes a part of the Roman state, but it's important to know what's going on in the area um, of the Italian peninsula before Rome. So the Etruscan civilization was the most significant one before that of ancient Rome. And the Etruscans had a long history going back to about the geometric and archaic period in Greece. And Etruria and Greece had some things in common. They were both sea powers. They had independent city states. And the Etruscans even borrowed some motifs and styles from the ancient Greece. And then eventually the Romans kind of assumed Etruria and eventually took over Greece as well. So here we have a model of an Etruscan temple because none of the Etruscan temples survived because they were built with wood and mud brick. And they're actually somewhat similar to the ancient Egyptian funerary architecture and temples, and that the Etruscans decorated the walls with low relief sculpture and imagery. So it was similar in the idea that the Egyptians were trying to duplicate like their earthly environments, having food, having family around in eternity. That's kind of similar thing showed up in the Etruscan artwork on the walls as well on their funerary monuments. We've learned about the Etruscans from a lot of the sculpture that still exists from their civilization, and this is an example of figurative sculpture on a sarcophagi. So this sarcophagus it's essentially a coffin, and the man and the wife are depicted as if they're enjoying like a dinner entertainment, kind of reclining on this little lounge couch, and looking at their faces, you can kind of see some similarities in some of the artwork that we've seen with kind of a general shape eye and a very stylized hair depiction with just kind of repeated patterns to make it look like texture. It's a little bit more relaxed than the archaic Greek sculpture. So the Etruscans are kind of relaxed and having, an enjoyable, pleasant time on this depiction of something that would have been used for death. Beginning in 509 BCE, the Roman system of government was a republic, which was a constitutional government with a senate of upper-class patricians and an assembly of lower-class plebeians. The Roman Republic collapsed in the civil war that ensued after the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, culminating in the assumption of the role of emperor by Octavian, called Augustus, in 27 BCE. And the art of the Roman Republican period included realistic, unidealized portrait busts and decorative frescoes and mosaics. So we'll see that the Romans really kind of absorbed other cultures into their styles, like the Greeks and the Etruscans. And so sometimes that might seem like Romans were just kind of imitators of Greek art, but There are other kind of innovations that the Romans brought in that can disprove that assumption. The Romans were also master builders. They invented concrete, and they have created some of the grandest monuments in the history of architecture. So in ancient Rome, it was customary for Romans to make a wax death mask of their loved ones and keep them around the house, like we do with photos. And sometimes the masks were translated into more permanent medium, like bronze or terracotta. And this is an example of the realism that we see in Roman sculpture. And the fact that this person has wrinkles is is an example of that realism, where they're not trying to idealize the figure. They're meaning like they're including all all the warts and wrinkles is how we say it. So it's an example of not idealization, and making it a little bit more of a true portrait sculpture. Here is an example of the inside of a domestic space, and the Romans liked to cover the walls with scenes of nature, almost as if they're trying to make it seem like a window to the outside world, like create the illusion that you're really in this little garden. So you have blue sky, you have the depiction of trees, there are, excuse me, songbirds, things like that. It's it's supposed to look like a little garden, just on the inside of a wall. Here's a detail of that same garden scape, just so you can see the attention to detail, and the naturalism that we're seeing with the depiction of nature. And some of the best examples of the wall painting were found among the ruins of Pompeii. When Julius Caesar, who was a dictator, was no longer the ruler, Rome entered its empire period under the rule of Octavian Caesar, who is later called Augustus. And this period marks the beginning of the Roman Empire, where Rome is ruled by an emperor, and the Pax Romana, which is a 200-year period of peace. And during this time, Roman architecture shifted towards the erection of splendid buildings and civic monuments that glorified the empire and its benefit for those under its power. Roman architects borrowed from Greek traditions, but they also introduced some innovations in building design, like the arch and the use of concrete to replace cut stone. And sculptures of this period combined the realism of the Republican period with Greek idealism. All right, we're going to look at the Colosseum. The Colosseum is just one of the major innovations by the ancient Romans. The Roman conquerors brought benefits of urban planning, lots of roads, bridges, police and fire protection, water systems, sanitation, and food. And as you can see, this is an event arena. So there were public baths and theaters and things like that. So this piece of architecture was built for entertainment and festivals, the Colosseum. And we are aware that there were lots of contests between animals and men, and grueling battles between gladiators. And so not always necessarily positive outcomes for everybody inside these arenas. But this was just an innovation in terms of how many people it could hold. It was, at one time, it had the ability to extend shade out over to certain sections so that the people watching could not be baked in the sun. It could accommodate about 55,000 spectators. And it was interesting when I was in Rome seeing this. They had actually used it for the original Gladiator movie. They filmed part of it in there, so they had reconstructed part of the floor to be able to film the movie in the actual Colosseum, of course, with some CGI to help fill in what's been damaged. The Colosseum structure has influenced a lot of other stadiums. And so the textbook shows a few other examples. This was the stadium that was built in Berlin for the 1936 Olympics when Adolf Hitler was in charge of Germany. And this one is the interior space of built for Rome itself, actually. And you can see that same kind of circular format that was used there. And then this is kind of a really unique variation on the Colosseum. The structure for the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing, China, it's kind of this donut-shaped structure that kind of looks like it's wrapped up with string or something like that. But these all are examples of how these stadiums can really symbolize the transformation of a city into a major force of its time. We mentioned the expertise of the Romans with building, and I've shown you the Ponte Guard before. This was one of the most outstanding Roman civic projects that carried water over really long distances. This particular aqueduct is in southern France, and it carried water more than 30 miles, and it could provide about 100 gallons of water per day to the recipients. And the whole thing is based on having it built so it slopes down gradually over long distances, so that gravity is the force that's carrying the flow of water. One of the best examples of the innovation of Roman architecture is in the Pantheon. So the Pantheon was a temple built to honor all the gods. So Pan means all, and Thea is the god. So that's how you can remember the difference. I always had a hard time telling the difference between Pantheon and Parthenon. But Pantheon is the building in Rome dedicated to all the gods. It no longer holds any of the sculptures of the Roman gods, and it's been a Christian church for a really long time, since like the year 600. But this is a good example of Roman innovation influence from the Greeks. So the building itself is a drum shape, so think a cylinder shape, and then they have pretty much stuck a Greek temple front on the front of it. So you've got the columns, and this is where you can see an example of the Corinthian style columns. So the columns for Corinthian style are smooth. They're no longer fluted, which means ridged. They have a base. They have a smooth shaft for the column, and then the top of the capital for a Corinthian column look like little leaves overlapping each other. They're called acanthus leaves. And then we still have the pediment. And in this case, the pediment for the Pantheon is blank. And then the building itself, the interior, is a cylindrical building with a dome on the top. And the dome is made from concrete, and it has an opening at the top of the dome called an oculus. And it's completely open, and that would allow for light to shine in. The ceiling of the dome is also called coffered, which is just the little kind of recessed square shapes that you can see to help lighten the dome itself, so it's not quite so thick everywhere. And that is made from concrete. So that was one of the major innovations of the Romans during this time period. This sculpture of Augustus of Prima Porta is a great example of the Greek influence on Roman sculpture. So we have a balance of idealization and individualization. So we know that the facial features for Augustus do look similar to what he actually looked like based on his image that has been depicted on empire coins. But then we also have the kind of idealized anatomically perfect body from the ancient Greek sculptures. We've got the contrapposto pose where we have one leg that is the tension and one leg that's relaxed and one arm that's relaxed and one arm that's more active, and that's very balanced. He's holding his arm up kind of in this like kind of victory kind of gesture, and we see some of that drapery from the classical influence. So we have kind of this kind of reference almost to the ancient Greek gods with that like allegory of kind of more than human. So I mentioned the era of peace during the Roman Empire, and that is celebrated in the Arapakis, which is the altar of peace. And I want you to just imagine four walls, like a small room with an open ceiling that surround a sacrificial altar. And these walls were adorned with relief sculptures. And here's a detail from one of them. And this is a imperial procession, and one of the things that we want to emphasize is that we have some influence from the Greeks, but there's some differences in the fact that there are individuals that are rendered in kind of portrait likenesses, meaning we don't know who all of these people are, but they're all individualized, meaning like the artist has taken the time to not just make like little generic humans, but try to depict different ages, different hairstyles, things like that. We also have a relief sculpture that's commemorating a specific event with specific people present. So it's not celebrating something from a long time ago. It's actually depicting current events at the time that it was made. And you see some attempt to create a three-dimensional space. There's some overlapping, right? The children are in front, the adults are behind them. You see some adults in front of other adults. There's an attempt to make a realistic sense of space. People are turning, gesturing, looks like they're talking to each other, things like that. So we have an attempt to make this even more realistic, even though it's on a relief sculpture. And here is an example of a new design, the equestrian portrait. So this is a bronze sculpture of Marcus Aurelius. He was an emperor, and he's gesturing to his troops, or maybe recognizing the applause of his people. This combines the Roman love of realism with a little bit of a concern for psychological portraits, trying to show the type of person that Marcus Aurelius was. He's got the flowing robes. He's sitting, very confidently on his horse. His facial expression is calmed and reserved. So we have the kind of what he stands for being the most important thing, the kind of serene image of imperial authority. During its late years, the Roman Empire was torn apart from within. By the time of the late Emperor Constantine, the capital of the empire was in Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul. And imperial power had shifted to the Eastern Empire, leaving the Rome and the Western Empire vulnerable. After centuries of Roman persecution of Christians, Constantine, proclaimed tolerance for the faith through the Edict of Milan in 313. The art of the late empire reflects the combination of Roman influences and diverse religious traditions. So many of the early Christian worship places were house churches, and this is the interior of a synagogue that is reconstructed in Syria. It was originally in Syria, what is now today Syria, and it's been reconstructed. So we see on the walls some frescoes, somewhat similar to the way that the ancient Romans painted directly on the walls. And in this case, there's images from the stories of the Bible and Jewish history. And then the little niche in the wall would have been where they kept the Torah. And this is one detail of the images that are painted on the walls. And this is a fresco of Moses and the Exodus of the Jews leaving Egypt. And you can see that the largest people in the image are Moses and Aaron, and so kind of indicating that they are the central figures of the people. And you see there's a little bit of naturalism. Moses is kind of in a contrapposto pose, showing that influence of Roman art, and his kind of detached kind of facial expression is similar to that equestrian sculpture that we saw with Marcus Aurelius. When it comes to architecture of the late Roman Empire, the basilica is going to be a really important structure that we see from the Romans that is translated into Christian churches and cathedrals later on. So this is the Basilica Nova that was started prior to Constantine, and Constantine finished it. And a basilica is essentially a large public meeting hall for the Romans, and it's long rectangle shape. It kind of divided up into some similar spaces, but this idea of just a long rectangle shape, that is the nave is the central aisle, and then it kind of has two side aisles on either side. That is going to be a structure that we see translated into the churches later on. Not much of the Basilica Nova exists today, but we do have the head of Constantine, which was part of a colossal sculpture of the emperor that would have been in the Basilica Nova. And the head sculpture itself is more than 8 feet high and weighs more than 8 tons. And the rest of the body would have been a wooden torso covered with bronze, and the head and the limbs were made out of marble. And if you look at the face, you can kind of see a lot of the components before it's of sculpture that are kind of circling back. It's both a combination of realism and idealism. The really thick, wide staring eyes are almost kind of go back to some of those archaic sculptures that we saw that are a little bit less realistic, and then kind of just that very kind of blank expression that we see from like the portrait of Marcus Aurelius. So we're ending our discussion about the Roman Empire with the beginnings of Christianity, and we'll see that over time, Christianity is going to spread and continue to flourish. And I think it's important for us to look at some other artwork that's going on in the wider world around this same similar time, specifically with some of the other world religions. So we're going to start with Buddhism. And Buddhism and Hinduism are polytheistic religions, meaning that they believe in more than one god or deity. And Buddhists also believe in reincarnation. So it's a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that can be broken when individuals free themselves of desire. So Buddhism flowered in the earlier Indian religious traditions in the 6th century BCE. Its founder is Prince Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha or enlightened one, who renounced his birthright and chose to live a life of discipline, self-denial, and meditation that would lead to nirvana, or total comprehension of the universe. The piece that we're looking at is the capital to a column that was erected by the Emperor Ashoka, who was a convert to Buddhism. And this was made to commemorate the place where the Buddha is believed to have preached his first important sermon. We had a circular pedestal that the lions are standing on, and it represents the wheel of law, which is set into motion by the Buddha. That's called the Dharma. And the 4 small animals around the wheel represent the 4 corners of the earth. This is the Great Stupa in Sanchi, India, and stupas were places of worship and devotion. It's believed that after his death, the Buddha was cremated and the remains were placed in 8 different stupas across India. This one was completed in the 1st century CE, and it has a large dome that symbolizes the sky. I use this as an example for dome architecture in that lecture. And the dome is separated from the base by a little stone railing, and pilgrims that come to this place to worship circumnavigate, which means they walk around in a circle. They walk around in the mound in a clockwise direction. And this relationship to the monument on the outside versus the inside is going to be a little bit different than when we start studying the Christian churches more in depth, which meaning there's more interaction on the inside of the church for Christians. This is a sculpture of a Yakshi, which is a pre-Buddhist goddess still hanging around on some Buddhist sculpture. And she was believed to embody the generative forces of nature. So this is a decorative sculpture, and she is depicted as a symbol of the forces of nature. And that's something that we're going to see in contrast to Western religious art as well. For a long time, there were no images of the Buddha, and then sculptures started to be made, and many of them show some Western influence that can be traced back to the contact with Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire. This particular sculpture that we're seeing is wearing an ancient Greek kind of style clothing, and other Buddhas sculptures that we see are very much more decidedly Indian. So depending on the time and the place that the sculptures were made, sometimes you do see some Western influence. At the same time that the Roman Republic flourished in the West, the Qin dynasty of China under the first emperor of Qin, Shi Huangdi, emerged as a dominant power in the East. Architecture and sculpture of the Qin dynasty is associated with two renowned and ambitious works, the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army of Shi Huangdi. The Huan dynasty succeeded the Qin dynasty, ruling China for some 4 centuries, during which Confucianism emerged as the foundation of education and conduct in China. The Great Wall of China was built to protect people from invaders, and it is 5,500 miles long. It is such a serious fortification that you can actually see it from space. And it was a really grand project that was initiated by Shi Huangdi, as well as the Terracotta Army. So there's so much we could say about this topic. This is one that is very fascinating to me. But in 1974, these warriors were discovered, and actually the burial mound itself has not been excavated, but this was part of the tomb for the emperor. And it was designed that these terracotta warriors, so they're made out of clay, along with bronze horses and chariots, were all made prior to his death and made to be buried with him, so that in the afterlife, the emperor would have an entire army to protect him. These warriors are life-size figures. They would have all been painted individually, and they have been somewhat individualized, meaning they're not all just carbon copies of each other. They have different hairstyles and things like that. I would highly recommend you go on YouTube and probably type this in and find some videos about the Terracotta Army. It's super fascinating just to see the amount of work that went into something that was just going to be buried. After the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty succeeded, and they governed China for about 4 centuries. And during that time, just to parallel what's going on in the Western world, Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome. Mark Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide after their forces were defeated by Octavian. Jesus was born and died in the Middle East. Rome built the aqueducts and the stadiums in Europe, and the Pantheon was erected. So in its time, Qianyang, which was in China, was one of the world's largest cities of the day. So the Han Emperor Wudi was a good patron of the arts, philosophy, and literature, and they ushered in the Confucianism. And Confucianism is named after the philosopher Confucius, and it's more than a religion; it's more of an ethical system. And it speaks of the cosmos as influenced by metaphysical opposition, like thinking of yin and yang. So there is a value on religious rituals, and that was one of the main teachings, was those of Confucius in China at that time. So the artwork that was done during this time, we're looking at an example of a bronze flying horse from the tomb of Governor General. And this is certainly in kind of in the style of realism, and certainly follows in the same vein of burying soldiers and animals with the leaders so that they would have them in the afterlife. And this is an architectural model, and it's mostly just to give you an idea of the type of architecture that existed in China at this time. So there were palaces, city walls, and gateways with towers. And this is an example of one of those towers. And this is made from clay, but in the real world, they would have been built with other materials as well, wood and stone and things like that. Okay, and then jumping across the ocean, going over to Olmec art. So, what is now Mexico and Central America, the pre Columbian Olmec civilization, this is Mesoamerica's earliest civilization. It thrived from about 1500 to 400 BCE. And so that parallels with about the Mycenaean era in the West with the golden age of Greece. So, just so you have an idea of like what's happening when. And the Olmec civilization declined around 400 BCE, but aspects of its religious rituals and culture lived on in the Mayan and Aztec civilizations. Certainly one of the most famous artworks from the Olmec culture are the gigantic heads that have been found. They are about 12 feet in height. They're carved from stone, and they are generally believed to be represent the earthly rulers or possibly gods. We're not totally sure. And you can see that they're kind of just kind of generic face. We don't think that they're necessarily portrait sculptures. The Olmecs inhabited tropical lowlands, and then there were also settlements in like the highlands in Mexico, and that is where a major urban complex called Teotihuacan was established around 100 BCE. And so this is an aerial shot of the remains of that city that we call Teotihuacan, and it's just about 30 miles north of Mexico City. And at its peak in around 600 CE, about as many as 200,000 people lived and worked there. It was making it one of the largest cities in the world. It was designed on a grid plan and has some pyramids similar maybe to structures that we've seen other pyramids from other places of the world. There were shrines and temples, and they had steep stairways that led to other temples that are no longer in surviving. But they've also found mural paintings, and they believe that a lot of the temples were destroyed by fire around 600 CE. And that is going to conclude this lecture.